And we are rolling. I have a video here today going through Mercer County, one of the bike trails around there. We're going to discuss the book Expert Heads Up No Limit by Will Tipton. If you're new to this channel, the idea is that I ride around on my electric unicycle and I kind of discuss some poker related concepts. The idea is to attract people both to poker content and people who are interested in doing bigger things outside of poker. So what you're going to see are some ads down in the lower right hand corner. If that's relevant to you, I'm basically paying for people who have skill sets that can help me out achieve some other things. And you're also going to see just some Christian related banners in the upper right hand side. So now that we have all of that out of the way, today we're going to do the first couple chapters of Expert Heads Up No Limit. Going to have a small presentation and just kind of talk about some of the notes. So chapter 1 of Heads Up No Limit talks about the decision tree in poker. And poker itself is a wonderful game because the game is just too large to figure out. It's never really going to be solved because it's just too big. So what we do and how we reduce the complexity of the game is we make decision trees. So the idea of a decision tree, especially in Heads Up, is you start with the small blind and their first action can basically be to fold or raise or to call, but the chapter and the book starts off with more sort of similar concepts. We start with first nodes of raising, and then the big blind has a response to fold, call, or raise. And looking at this tree here, it helps us kind of simplify and see things down node. And we have different sort of routes, our root actions, and we can follow them all the way down to the leafs, which is a final action. So if you're not kind of familiar with that, it is decision trees that allow us to break down the game and figure it out. We do these decision trees, and what we do with them is we make approximations. So there are several approximations that we can be making that we'll make use of throughout the rest of this book and in general. But some of the options are narrowing our strategic options, which means like we simplify our sizes and we ignore unlikely lines. For example, there's not going to be anything where we raise to 90% of our stack and then fold. We simplify our sizes, bet sizing wise, we can look at just, a few more standard kind of bet sizes instead of just a million different ones. We can remove future card possibilities. So, on the turn and river, there's over 2.5 million combinations of kind of cards that we can get to. And we're going to simplify that down into more standard boards and textures. If you're familiar with the software like GTO Plus or PO, that's something like the aggregate reports. Maybe they simplified that down to essentially like 163 trees that represent most of the board textures, because the game is just too big to have every run out and look at everything. So we start to simplify our board and range structures. And at the time, we only consider one part of the tree. Maybe if we're on the river, we're not going back and going to consider actions on the flop. We're just sort of looking at tree decisions. So that's the first chapter. It's kind of discussing what decision trees are and how they can help us out in the game. Moving on to chapter 2 is game theoretic strategies. And the idea here is we need to develop strategy against our opponents. And there's two main ways to do that. The first is identifying ranges and for the different actions they may take. And the second is to compute the most profitable responses to their strategy. The first one, identifying ranges, is more relevant to tournament players where there's just such a dynamic amount of different starting stack sizes and positions. And so much of the game in figuring out ranges is comes down to pre-flop decisions given current like stack sizes and everything like that. And the second one that we just talked about, is computing the most profitable response, is more of a cash game kind of thing like that, where ranges and bet sizes are kind of more standardized. So we're looking at the best kind of response that we can be taking against those things. The book, Will Tipton, he has a different way of measuring EV that I wanted to touch on. He calculates EV from our starting and finishing stack sizes. It's the stack size, not the change in EV. So we may be Familiar with, say, a decision of an EV of fold, maybe 0, right? There's not going to be any chips. We're just saying the EV there is 0 of a fold. He would say the EV of that action is our final stack sizes. There's not going to be any real difference because the changes in EVs are going to be the same no matter what. It's not like, changing the strategy is going to change EVs. But what we'll find out is that Will prefers to look at it at final stack sizes of actions. He finds it like an easier way to compute. So I wanted to mention that because the book does go through most of its math with that format. So a few other notes from that chapter is talking about maximally exploitive strategies, and that's the most profitable response to a fixed strategy. To max our total profitability of the strategy, we must play every individual hand to its highest possible EV. And that's a really important concept. A lot of people have a misconception about GTO where there's a type of hands that are like loss leaders. We're playing hands worse than they potentially might be because it helps the rest of our range out. And that's just simply wrong. That's not what GTO is. We're playing every hand to the greatest possibility and the highest EV that it can ascertain and make for our range. It moves into discussing Nash strategy constituents, and this is when both strategies are maximally exploiting each other simultaneously. And what we arrive at is something called the solution concept. That's the idea when the strategy is finalized because there can be no gains from the deviation. And that kind of relates to like a min-max strategy where it's GTO to minimize our maximum expected loss. That's what GTO does for us. It talks about also the concept of fictitious play, which you're going to be familiar with in a range where it's a mixed strategy. Instead of playing a hand 100%, a pure way every single way, to maximize the EV of certain lines and certain hands, maybe you're raising or calling 90% of the time and you're taking an alternative line, say 10%. And that's how solvers basically find out max EV. When things aren't pure, they use fictitious play and they start taking things from 100% and a pure and they start checking out what it may be at a reduced frequency. And it's kind of these reduced frequencies where they can find more EV by putting different combinations in different lines. So there's some certain things to keep in mind when we're talking about inducing, exploitable villains. When we're talking about, finding all these EVs and when we're deviating from stuff like that. There's certain tendencies that we want to target. Maybe if someone is overfolding later, we want to keep their range weaker at the start, or maybe if they call stronger earlier, their range is going to be stronger, so we're more likely to give up later. So when we are making these decisions too, we want to always be making decisions that make villain play worse, right? Maybe that's exploring other areas of the game tree through introducing new lines and standards and things like that that put us in a position where villain comes to certain nodes of the tree that he's just less capable of playing well, and so we can find more EV in that way. And that's kind of changing villains into expected or unexpected ways. So this is all kind of stuff that once we get into figuring out how to play more exploitively, once after we have our GTO solution concept, we need to start exploring, what exploitive different plays will be. If we move away from GTO, we need to figure out the response and why we're kind of moving in that directions and what it'll do to villain strategy. Moving on into the third chapter. The third chapter is pre-flop only games. A lot of this chapter is coming down to sort of chart and math work. It starts with smaller concepts of smaller stack sizes. It's kind of like, raise call ranges or raise folds, pre-flop only games where the decisions are basically such that it's a reduced game tree. And when it's a reduced game tree like that, it's more easy to figure out kind of balanced responses to everything. In a pre-flop only game with reduced options like that, if a player shoves with a particular hand, it means that the shove in that case is at least as profitable as folding versus an unexploitable villain, right? That's where we're essentially made indifferent because the two EVs are the same. The strategy can't be changed in any way. So in this situation, in a pre-flop only game, with a balanced strategy, if a hand becomes a shove, it just means that that line is at least as profitable as a fold. So this matters a lot because in heads up no limit, the small blind's first decision, the fold or not, it really depends a lot on the big blind's response. You know, if they're under defending, we're going to raise more. If they're over defending, you know, that's going to change our strategy as well. And we'll eventually get to and look at this sort and talk about a little bit of this, what this MS Paint graph is below. But the book itself covers a lot of different preflop only situations where the math has been done to figure this stuff out. What is it that the big blind is responding with, and what should the small blind's response be in relation to that? When we are figuring out our opening ranges and such, card removal does have an effect on raise shove games, but it's really pretty minimal. You know, it is going to matter. Like, these are talking about blockers. It's definitely important to consider that stuff like that. One thing to realize is once we get away from just raise fold, it's not just blockers that are important. It's the actual hand values for post flop play that may be better. That may be more important than just what shove blockers are. So just mathematically, this is kind of what this graph is trying to show, that the idea is if big blind plays back less than 50%, the small blind should always be open raise folding, right? When the big blind doesn't respond appropriately enough, we can just print money by raising more. This strategy will start to change once the stacks get deeper. The small blind strategy becomes raise call once the big blind himself starts shoving greater than 50%. The big blind will stop expanding his jamming range right at the point at which raise fold is no longer profitable for small blind relative to folding. The big blind basically creates his strategy so that the small blind becomes indifferent. It's a pretty important concept, and it's basically, you know, once we start monitoring how the big blind responds to us, you know, we have to take into account, is he over defending, under defending, and the appropriate responses for such. The graph here is kind of showing the line that moves vertical, and then down to the right is the small blind's response, and the line that moves up and to the right is the big blind's response, and we can see that they kind of meet around half and half there. And if the big blind himself is starting to, you know, defend more or less, it changes how the small blind chooses and does his plays. All that is to say, there's a few more notes about that. The option to call will greatly change what GTO play is. You know, the option to call greatly expands the decision tree, so it introduces a lot more mathematical complexity, which is really important. But before we get to that point, if we're looking at a tree that's kind of simplified like this, we should, and we're considering how we open, the small blind should always min raise. The small blind should always min raise essentially because he's going to be facing decisions that will be the same in terms of profitability, but he will lose more in his raise fold decision. If the small blind is raising and then folding, if his raise sizer is larger, he's just giving more money to the big blind when the big blind shoves. But he profits the same when the big blind essentially just folds himself. Obviously, if you raise a little bit more pre-flop, the big blind has to defend less, and so the big blind can re-raise, you know, less frequent, and the small blind then has to then tailor his strategy in a different way. So basically, that is to say, larger sizes mean that the big blind has to defend less, which is easier for the big blind, and it gives away a disadvantage of the small blind being able to open more frequently with a min raise. Now, as we get on to discussing that a little bit more, the point about GTO is that accurate frequency estimation is kind of like the key to exploitive strategies. If we think people are doing anything too much in one direction, then we counter exploit by essentially moving all of our actions towards a more pure response. If big blind is going to be overfolding, right, we're going to be raising just a lot more. And we find that, works, and that concept holds true in pretty much all the game nodes and all the, think about a river decision. If someone is folding too much, if they're not defending enough, we can just bluff and bet 100% of the time, and we profit, even if the other player, the villain, is calling with a stronger range. So that was the first 3 chapters. It was basically kind of a quick introduction into what GTO is and how to start computing GTO ranges in heads up, no limit. The idea was a lot of it was more reduced and solved from more simpler strategies like pre-flop only games where there are less nodes. It's raise shove, raise call kind of nodes like that. And these approximations really help us get a grasp of what heads up no limit can be, because the game itself is way too big. So we need to start finding reduced and simplified strategies ourselves if we want to be profitable. So I think this is a pretty fun ride. The rest of the book has a lot more to cover. It's more in depth. It goes into sort of indifference principles and range equities and river decisions, which I'm going to cover in future videos. But for now, I'm going to just kind of let this run out. I had a really enjoyable ride here. We're coming into Lawrenceville, New Jersey, which is where I did an earlier video. So there's a few more minutes left in the ride. If you're enjoying it, I'm just going to keep letting it play before coming to an end. And I appreciate you watching here today. If you have any comments, please leave them below. And I appreciate any feedback, and it helps to get any likes, subscribes, and especially shares. So click those buttons now, and thanks so much for watching.